The Intoxication of Mythology. Vocatus acte vocatus deus aderit. Called or not, God will be present. In 1908, Jung had this proverb carved on the portal of the house he had built in Kunach, on the upper shore of Lake Zurich. The statement was from the Delphic oracle, reproduced in the Dutch Renaissance, Humanus Aramus, proverbs from classical authors. Jung's closely worked on the plan for the house. The following year, he resigned his post as senior physician at Bergalzi Hospital to devote himself to his growing practice and his research interests. He kept his position as a lecturer in the medical school, where he continued to give courses on the psychology of the unconscious and psychoanalysis. His retreat from the Bergalzi coincided with a shift in his research interests to the study of mythology, folklore, and religion, and he assembled a vast private library of scholarly works. These researches culminated in the transformations and symbols of the libido, published in 2 installments in 1911 and 1912. It marked a return to Jung's intellectual roots and to his cultural and religious preoccupations. He found that mythological work exciting and intoxicating. It seemed to me I was living in an insane asylum of my own making. He recalled in 1925, I went about with all these fantastic figures, centaurs, nymphs, satyrs, gods, and goddesses, as though they were patients and I were analyzing them. I read a Greek or a Negro myth as if a lunatic were telling me his anamnesis. The end of the 19th century saw an explosion of scholarship in the newly founded discipline of comparative religion and ethnopsychology. Primary texts were collected and translated for the first time and subjected to historical scholarship in collections such as Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East. For many, these works represented an important revitalization of the Christian worldview. In Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, Jung differentiated 2 kinds of thinking. Taking his cue from William James, among others, he contrasted directed thinking and fantasy thinking. The former was verbal and logical, the latter was passive, associative, and imaginistic. The former was exemplified by science and the latter by mythology. Jung claimed that the ancients lacked the capacity for direct thinking, which was a modern acquisition. Fantasy thinking took place when directed thinking ceased. Transformations and Symbols of the Libido was an extended study of fantasy thinking and of the continued presence of mythological themes in the dreams and fantasies of contemporary individuals. Jung reiterated the anthropological equation between the prehistoric, the primitive, and the child. He held that the elucidation of current-day fantasy thinking in adults would concurrently shed light on the thought of children, savages, and prehistoric peoples. In this work, Jung synthesized 19th century theories of memory heredity and the unconscious and posited a phylogenetic layer to the unconscious, still present in everyone and consisting of mythological images. For Jung, myths were symbols of the libido, and they depicted its typical movements. He used the comparative method of anthropology to draw together a vast panoply of myths, and then subjected them to analytical interpretation. He later termed his use of the comparative method amplification. He claimed that there had to be typical myths which corresponded to ethnopsychological development of complexes. Following Jacob Burckhardt's, he termed such typical myths primordial images. One particular myth was given a central role, that of the hero. For Jung, this represented the life of the individual attempting to become independent and to free himself from the mother. He interpreted the incest motif as an attempt to return to the mother to be reborn. He was later to herald this work as marking the discovery of the collective unconscious, though the term itself was of a later date. In his preface to the 1952 revision of Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, Jung noted that the work was written in 1911, his 36th year. The time is a critical one, for it marks the beginning of the second half of life, when a metonia, a mental transformation, not infrequently occurs. He was conscious of the loss of his collaboration with Freud and was indebted to his wife for her support. After completing the work, he realized the significance of what it meant to live without a myth. One without a myth is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question, and had to admit that I was not living with a myth, or even in a myth, but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities, which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. So I told myself, how could I, when treating my patients, make due allowance for the personal factor, for my personal equation, which is yet so necessary for a knowledge of the other person, if I was unconscious of it. The study of myth had revealed to Jung his mythlessness. He then undertook to get to know his myth, his personal equation. Thus we see that the self-experimentation that he undertook through exploring his own fantasy thinking was in part a direct response to theoretical questions raised by research that culminated in Transformation and Symbols of the Libido.